Hi students, we are going to continue talking about factor markets today. And last week we talked about factor markets in terms of labor. And if you remember, we talked particularly about an apple orchard and the situation with laborers in an apple orchard. And then I promised you that this week we would be talking about both the land and the capital as part of the factor market in an apple orchard. And we're using Mancuse examples, and then we're going to relate it to one other today in class. This will be a short video, hoping about 15 minutes. And then I'm going to go ahead and let you study last week's notes and today's notes on factor markets and take a quiz just to cement your learning before we move on to a new chapter. So chapter 18 is rather short, but just to review, we're talking about factor markets, and what we mean is those places where households are going into the marketplace and selling to firms. So when you think about when a firm is in the market for something, a firm is in the market for land, capital, and labor, all right? And so they're there to purchase labor hours, for their businesses or to sell their goods or for their factories or for their service industries. They need to have land, whether they buy that land and purchase it or rent that land, and we're going to talk about that today as well. And then they also need capital, the things that make their business possible. So we talked about in the apple orchard, you've got the apple pickers, and that's what we spent most of our time on last week. But then we also understand that there's other parts to an apple orchard. So in an apple orchard, you've got your apple pickers, those that go out and pick the fruit every day. And we talked about different things that can affect the wages of apple pickers. But we also have the orchard itself, the size of the orchard, and also the capital. In other words, what are the tools that you need in order to run an apple orchard business, the things that you need to make money off of an apple orchard to begin with. So last week we talked about how the number of laborers you hire is directly related to marginal costs, and what we want to watch out for are diminishing marginal returns on our investment as the apple orchard. And so we asked ourselves, well, if each picker is going to be able to pick a certain number of apples, and we know that the number of bushels that they can pick per week will decline with every additional unit of labor that we put into the apple orchard, that does not mean that it makes the most sense only to hire one worker. Doesn't mean that at all, because, yeah, I mean, there's more apples on the trees if you hire no workers, but then that doesn't get the job done. And so we saw that we could logically and graphically predict the number, all things being equal, right, all other things being equal, the number of apple pickers that an orchard would need based on prices, based on output of the individual pickers, and what would be the smart decision about where to stop the hiring. And we saw that that point is where you can still be profitable on the number of workers that you have out in the orchard. So you'll be reviewing that on your own, reviewing the terms that we discussed, terms such as labor itself. We talked about last week finding equilibrium in the labor market, and we talked about the other factors that could potentially affect the price of workers, like output price, in other words, the price of apples to begin with, technological change. So we saw that there's a value of the marginal product, diminishing marginal product, which we just mentioned, marginal product of labor. Make sure you go over the definitions that I gave you last week as we talked about this marginal product of labor in factor markets before you take the quiz. And understand that just as we discussed last week, there's a supply and demand that can be charted for labor, and that supply and demand is on the factor side, but it adheres to the same laws of supply and demand in demand markets, in the markets that firms are producing, where householders are going to buy. So we can easily understand that If the price of apples goes way up, a household will want to buy less. Same way with a firm. If the price of labor goes way up, the firm will want to purchase less of the labor. And that's where the arguments against minimum wage come from for economists, because just because you declare something to be true by law and say, well, we think the workers are worth $15 an hour or $20 an hour, or for that matter, $200 an hour, it doesn't mean the firm can pay that and still be profitable. You can't just decree something by law and make it happen without having other effects in the marketplace. And we learned when we talked about minimum wage that the effect of the marketplace can be unemployment, that minimum wage can actually decrease the number of people employed. And that's simply because of what we've been talking about, diminishing marginal value of the labor, because they cannot, in those cases when the price per hour is inflated above the product of the price of an apple, they cannot pick enough apples to be worth their labor, and that puts people into a bad position where they're thus unemployed. So we're going to move on today, and we're going to talk about land and capital, but still in factor markets. So you've got to get your head like an orchard person, okay? A person who owns an orchard, and this person who wants to be in the apple picking business, who wants to be in the apple business, wholesale, whatever, for people to come and buy apples from your apple farm. They have to deal not just with laborers, but also with land and capital. So some of this is going to be very, very applicable to the same lessons we learned last week. That's why it's a quick video today. And some of it will offer us a couple new things to think about. Okay, so we're going to keep going with Mankiw's ideas. And we said that, first of all, labor was directly resulted to the number of apple pickers, right? What money you can make. And when we talk about land, we talk about the size of the orchard that we have. How big of an orchard should this be? 100 acres, 150 acres, 200 acres? Well, all of that depends on the price of market for apples. At some point, if you could develop 1 million acres of apple trees, that might all be well and good, but we have to ask ourselves, is there going to be an overabundance of apples in the market at some place? Or will there be so many apples that people are willing to pay a price for this that's worth the picking, right? I mean, you can't just pay people, even without a minimum wage, okay? You can't just pay people a penny an hour. At least relatively you can't, because they won't take the job, all right? They won't take the job. It's not worth their time, effort, and energy to get up, to go to a job, to make a penny an hour. So it's not just that, well, whatever apples make, that's what I'll do. No. Suppliers, firms, they're looking for that point in the market where they can be profitable without driving themselves into the ground, okay? And so they're asking themselves, well, what does the price of the apple market bear? How much will someone pay for this? And how many apples do people want? Okay, there's a big difference, at least in the United States, between being, let's say, in the apple market and then being in the persimmon market or the dragon fruit market, right? Let's think of those fruits, and don't write me if it's a vegetable, okay? Everybody always does the fruit vegetable thing, just go with it, all right? So a persimmon, a dragon fruit, right? Let's assume those are fruits. And let's say that those fruits are just less demanded in the US marketplace. Well, they might be exotic. They might even be able to bring more of a price per unit. It might be much more expensive to buy a dragon fruit or a persimmon than a common apple. But in volume, you've got to take into account what kind of product do I have and what is the acreage, the size of the orchard that I want to buy, and how does that play in to my profitability. And then you also have capital. We hinted at this last week with talking about ladders and baskets, right? To have the apples picked efficiently, you need to be able to get to the top of an apple tree, and you need to be able to have a thing to carry the apples back and forth. You don't want your workers every time they have 2 apples in their hands walking it all the way back to the farmhouse and dropping it off into some kind of bucket. You want some kind of basket, some kind of bag that they can carry with them. And then you also need a ladder to be able to scale the trees to get to the apples that are outside of your reach. In addition to that, Maybe there's some new technology, some new equipment. Maybe there's some kind of truck that shakes the trees and allows the apples to fall directly into some kind of container. Certainly orchards have to think about this. ManQ brings up the idea of storage buildings to hold these apples overnight or for weeks before they go to sale or are brought to a marketplace, of trucks that bring the apples back and forth, of ladders, of baskets. And then interestingly, he talks about the idea of the apple trees themselves. You know, the orchard, unless you buy an apple orchard from someone else, it doesn't just come complete with lined up, perfectly spaced, well thought out apple trees, right? This is something that's cultivated over time. And so we make a decision about how many apple trees we should have in the orchard, how spaced they should be, what time of the year they should be expected to bloom. And so the apple trees themselves are a capital good, because remember, in this farm, you're not selling apple trees. You're selling apples, and that's a different product. If you were to sell apple trees, that's, I guess, a tree orchard, right? But here we're talking about apples. And so our apple trees then themselves are part of our capital goods. And so just like the other factors that we talked about, these items, land and capital, the same marginal rules apply. Let's see if we can take a quick look at the text here, all right? So let's see if I can get this. All right, so let's see. Okay, yeah, you can see that well. Okay, on the left, you have the market for land, and you simply understand that, like everything else, there's a demand curve, okay, and a supply curve, and that there's some kind of equilibrium price for land. And same with capital, a demand curve and a supply curve. There's, if you could get ladders for a super cheap price, you would certainly buy many of them. But if it costs you a lot to get ladders, you're going to buy fewer of them, right? For the supplier, if a person can sell you ladders for only a very little bit of money, you're going to buy very few ladders. But if they know that you are willing to pay a lot for those ladders, then they'll be willing to supply more. Right there in the middle is the equilibrium price in the factor market. And so, like everything else in economics, this functions on laws, it functions on behavior, it functions on predictability. And so you can see that demand and supply also affect the factor markets for land and capital. Let's think about one kind of interesting idea, though, when it comes to capital for just a moment. When it comes to land for just a moment, and it applies to capital too. One thing that ManQ cautions us to think about is whether or not you're thinking of a simple rental of land or rental of capital or ownership of land and capital. So these graphs that I just showed you, let's imagine that those are based on the rental of land. So let's say that you are hiring an apple picker, right? You're not hiring this apple picker and taking this person on for life. In fact, you are hiring them, most likely, as an hourly worker, or at least a time-based, if you're paying them a salaried worker. You're not paying for their whole lives, and really, they're there for the time that apples are being picked. It might be very likely, especially in the fruit picking industry, that you're hiring people for hourly wages, and they might not even be full-time workers. They might be part-time workers who get paid by the hour, the hours for which they work. And so in a sense, you need to think of that as you're renting the labor, right? You're not purchasing this labor forever. You're not going to be able to buy and sell your laborers. You're renting their labor. Well, with land or capital, you may be renting it or you may be purchasing it. So think of a typical store, perhaps that's in Citrus County. Think about a liquor store that's in a strip mall. Think about a candle store, a stationery store, or a hardware store that exists in one of these strip malls where it's one unit amongst many. It's very likely that those stores do not own the property. Instead, they rent it per month. And that rental price makes it act in the supply and demand market with the most immediate thought. Okay, so let's think about this. Right now in this economic downturn, if a business is not locked into a contract as far as its rent, and that business does not see a way back to getting back open in the next few months, and they have no money and no reserves, and they've laid off their workers already, and then remember, their workers are rented, okay? That's why life is hard on people right now, all right? Because their labor is not being rented in the factor market. Well, if they rent a storefront and they're not locked into some kind of contract, it might be very likely that they give up that land. Okay, that is land that they are renting, but they might say, well, I can't afford to make the rent. Now, some landlords are trying to get the people to stay so that they don't end up with a lot of empty strip malls once this crisis is over. They might be willing to give a break on the rent. They might be willing to say, you know what, no one else is going to rent it for me, so just pay what you can or don't pay for 3 months. There was a story about one landlord, a retail landlord in one city that I happened to see, and he said, well, I don't want anyone to pay rent for the next 3 months. Well, that's advantage to both the renter and probably to the landlord as well. And there's nothing wrong with that because he hopes that within 3 months, those businesses will still be solvent and able to come back and begin paying the rent again. Not all landlords are in that position. Some landlords are paying their own rent on places that they own. And so they may need to pass that on to their consumers. They're paying for their own mortgages, their own rentals, their own labor, their own food, their own corporate realities. And so we shouldn't be quick to just say, well, anybody who wants to be paid for their rent right now is just an evil person. No, this is a person faced with economic realities, as we all are right now. And so the renter thinks about things in the more immediate. Now, at the same time, okay, let's think about if you owned that land. Okay, if you own an apple orchard, and let's say right now that nobody's coming to pick apples, that doesn't mean that you're going to quickly give up your land. And it changes the supply and demand market because when you own the apple orchard, you understand that it has a value that goes beyond the immediate value, and that long term and time play into this very seriously. You might have an apple orchard that you don't expect to produce apples maybe even ever again. And yet you may choose to hold on to the land if you own it, hoping to cash in on a future real estate development project or any kind of other project that may come into business in the future. Maybe somebody wants to come in and start a different kind of orchard, or maybe someone wants to come in and make it housing space. Maybe somebody wants to come in and rent it from you once a year to do a county fair. There's some locals in the area here in Citrus County that have undeveloped land, and they rent it out at certain times of the year to people who may want to use it for a short time for storage or for an event. And so if you own the land, you're not as immediately, you're immediately affected in the marketplace, but you're not going to respond to the supply and demand curve exactly like you would in the rental market, because you've got a factor down the road that you're thinking of, and that's the worth and value of your land. Same goes for capital. If you're renting ladders, you just simply call up the ladder company and say, my apple orchard's defunct, no one's coming, come and pick these ladders up, I don't want to rent from you one more day, hang up. But if you own all the ladders, you don't necessarily immediately go out and sell them all as soon as the season is over, because it's a good likelihood that holding on to those for 1 or 2 more seasons may be advantageous to you. Yes, there comes a point where businesses would sell things they own, including land and capital products, if they're in a cash crunch or they want to replace these things, or if the ladders are getting old enough and gross enough and rusty enough to where they say, you know what, let's not have that storage unit that we rent every year and store these ladders one more year. Let's throw them out, not rent the storage unit this year, and next year we'll buy all new ladders fresh. Why pay to store them in the off season? You see how you think about things when you own it versus when you rent it. I'm not saying that either one of those is necessarily better, okay? Because each business has to think about that individually. There are businesses where it might be better to rent the space than to own the space. And there are businesses where it might be better to own than rent. And those things change with the circumstances, the size of the business, the longevity of the business, the type of the business, etc. So it's not that we're saying renting is always better, buying is always better in either land or capital. What we're saying is that it will impact the supply and demand market in a different way, right? Okay, so this again is some micro stuff. We're talking about running a business. I like it. I think it's interesting. When we think about these things on a macro scale, we're getting more into the next two chapters, but we got to build on this chapter first. So there's one more thing that I want to talk about in terms of this factor market chapter, and that is linkages. Okay, so we talked about labor last week, talked about land and capital just now. Let's talk about linkages in the market. So linkages just means that one thing affects the other, right? And so the price of an apple, all right, can be affected by how much it costs to hire an apple picker, but it also can be affected by the price of ladders or the price of land rentals. And so when you think about these things, an impact in one market that actually has nothing to do with apples can impact the whole market. So let's say that there are a particular kind of apple picking ladders. Let's say that these ladders are the best in terms of height, stability, scalability, and weight for apple picking. And so there's this ladder company, and they have just put their eggs into one basket or put their apples into one basket, and they have kind of sold themselves as, you know, Joe's Apple Ladders, okay? Let's say, as ManQ does, that a hurricane comes in and destroys an apple crop, okay, and just knocks it out. Well, guess what? Because of linkages, the product in that product market now affects the factor market. The factor market for ladders means that there's far less of a demand for these special apple ladders that someone has developed because there just aren't apples to pick. And it also is going to affect the labor market for apples, for apple pickers. If there are no more apples and they're all on the ground and they're all ruined and no one wants to sell them anymore, then apple pickers lose out. Same thing with the rental situation. If you are renting capital goods like tractors, even though this has nothing to do with the apples, it has to do with a hurricane, it nonetheless has linkages, right? So I think that's pretty easy to understand, that there's linkages between labor, product, capital, and land, where one business affects the other, whether it's good or bad, right? If there's a sudden boom in the apple industry and everybody wants apples because they cure cancer, because they make you younger, then that ladder company can experience flush growth that really has nothing to do with their ladders, but it has to do with a linkage to another product that they're involved in. So when I thought about linkages, I thought that we'd bring this home especially to our own county, that is Citrus County. And maybe we could do something like compare apples to oranges, get it? And we could think about why Citrus County doesn't really produce citrus on a commercial scale. And if you look this up in Wikipedia, like I did, because I always was told that there was some kind of canker problem and that there was a specific disease problem. And to be honest, I never really knew. Maybe some of you do. Maybe you've taken a trip to the Citrus County Historical Society, or you've had a teacher who was more informed than me. But I decided to think a little bit about what happened that specifically killed the citrus market in Citrus County. Now, there are private growers. There are people who have citrus trees in their backyard, and there is a grove, Bellamy Grove, which is kind of the one working producing grove of Citrus County orange trees. But for the most part, the citrus industry in Citrus County died out. And it died out over a 2-year period, and that period was in the 1890s. So citrus growers in Citrus County made a business out of growing oranges after they came into contact with local Indians, Spaniards, and other settlers, and eventually French and English settlers as well, began to start to grow oranges, and they cultivated it until they were a sweet product that could be sold on a marketplace. And there was a tiny little citrus industry in Citrus County at one time. But in the winter of 1894 to 1895, it got incredibly cold, too cold for the citrus trees and the citrus crop to survive that year. And it damaged the citrus trees throughout Citrus County in the winter of 94 and again in the following winter of 95. And when citrus growers went out and they made an assessment of their fields, they realized that the capital issue, okay, not losing oranges for those 1 to 2 years, but the damage to their capital, their citrus trees, was untold, and that really it could not be bounced back from, that they would not be able to turn a profit for a very, very, very long time, for the foreseeable future, because of the damage to the capital, right, to the factor market of capital orange trees. And so the industry in Citrus County died out, and it was replaced with a new industry called the phosphate industry. And this was an industrial industry that many Citrus Countyans and other people, even in neighboring counties, especially Hernando County, were employed in. And that kind of has an interesting history. Right now, City of Inverness and the County of Citrus is connecting some old phosphate trails to the Withlacoochee Trail and kind of connecting this whole phosphate historical area to become recreational, because we don't have a phosphate industry very much in Citrus County. So if you want to do a little history on research on the phosphate industry, I think you can do that at the City of Inverness website and look up about the phosphate trails that they're connecting and a little bit of the history of the phosphate industry. But I thought that was interesting that right here in Citrus County, we have an example of something happening to the factor market and how it significantly changed something that in the past was a significant industry and today is really more of a backyard market and has a very, very limited market share. And so I hope that that'll help you to think well about the factor markets. You know, ManQ closes with something a little more dire. He closes with the Black Death. All right, and that's unfortunately a little bit timely right now to think about pandemics or to think about epidemics. It's kind of interesting though, because of course, the Black Death killed 1/3 of the population in many areas, and in some cities up to 1/2 over time in Europe, as this was an extremely devastating, this was a disease. And he points out that that disease had an impact on the labor market. What kind of impact do you think that the Black Death had on wages? Let's take a minute. What kind of impact did the Black Death have on wages for laborers? Right answer is a positive one, because there were far fewer laborers, and that meant that their wages could go up. So in the years after the Black Death, despite massive suffering that people endured, the fact that there were fewer laborers made their labor more valuable on that supply and demand scale. And so labor wages went up. Whereas the ownership of land, if you were part of the landed aristocracy at the time, that value of that land went down. because there's more land and fewer people to eat the yield from it and fewer people to work it. And so the land values went down. So there's a situation, right, where you would not hold to the idea that, oh, well, the rich always get richer and the poor always get poorer. That's certainly not true all of the time in history. There are certain conditions that can make that true, but there have been specific times in history where that wasn't true. Now, the Black Death impacted people across the board of all socioeconomic levels, but it had different impacts on the supply and demand charts, which led to different prices in the factor market for the goods of labor versus the goods of land. So really interesting stuff. I hope you're enjoying it like I am. And we're going to continue in chapters 19 and 20 this week. But what I'd like you to do now is go ahead and close the video, do a good review of your notes, and take the quiz over chapter 18 before you move on. Okay, guys, see you in chapter 19.